Let me tell you about an old Nebraska farmer who walked into a small town bank on a cold spring morning in April of 1979 to ask for an $18,000 operating loan and was turned away in the lobby in front of two other farmers and a young teller because the branch manager did not like the look of his coat. 3 years later, almost to the day, that same old farmer walked back through the same front door, wearing the same worn brown wool coat. And he handed that same branch manager a notice from the bank's holding company, informing him that as of close of business that afternoon, his employment with First Citizens Bank of Phelps County was terminated. Because the old farmer in the worn coat was, as of the morning's filing with the Nebraska State Banking Commission, the controlling shareholder of the entire institution, he had bought the bank. He had not raised his voice once in 3 years. He had simply waited. His name was Othel Sandborg. Most folks who had grown up alongside him called him Ott, which was the name on his fourth-grade reader at the Atlanta Consolidated School and on the volunteer fire department roster and on the membership rolls of the Phelps County Co-op. He was 68 years old in the spring of 1979. He was the fourth generation of Sandborgs to work the same 740 acres of dry and irrigated wheat and corn ground in Phelps County, Nebraska, a few miles south of the small town of Atlanta, and about 12 miles southwest of Holdrege, the county seat. His great-grandfather, Lars Sandborg, had stepped off a Burlington Northern rail car in Holdrege in the summer of 1879, with a single canvas bag of seed wheat from Karlskoga, Sweden, and had filed a homestead claim under the Timber Culture Act on a Friday afternoon in October of that year. Othel still had the original land office certificate, brown with age, framed on the wall above the kitchen table. He had married a woman named Inga Holmgren in the fall of 1936, 3 weeks after the wheat came off the field. Inga was a tall, plain-faced Lutheran girl from a farm near Funk, Nebraska, 2 counties to the west. They had been married for 38 years when Inga was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the summer of 1973. She lived another 15 months. She died in their kitchen on a cold October morning in 1974, with her hand on Othel's hand and the sun just coming up over the cottonwoods along the creek. They had not been able to have children. Othel had not remarried. He had not even considered it. He had not, in fact, slept in any other bedroom in the house since the morning Inga died, because to sleep elsewhere would have been to admit she was not coming back. He wore the same brown wool overcoat every day from October to April. The coat was a heavy double-breasted brown wool overcoat with 3 large dark horn buttons down the front and broad lapels and a sturdy lining of brown twill. His father Olav had bought it for him in the fall of 1958 at a department store in Lincoln on the occasion of Othel's 47th birthday, the year Olav sold his last team of Belgians and decided to give his son a coat that would last him to the end of his working life. The coat had outlasted Olav by 20 years. It had been mended at both elbows. The right cuff was beginning to fray. The lining was patched in 2 places. Inga had stitched the second patch herself in February of 1973, in the soft light of the kitchen lamp, 6 months before her cancer diagnosis. Othel intended to keep wearing the coat for as long as it held together, because his father had bought it for him, and because Inga had patched it, and because Othel Sandborg was a man who did not see the point of buying a new coat when the old one still did its job. This is the coat he was wearing on the morning of Tuesday, April the 17th, 1979, when he walked into the front door of First Citizens Bank of Phelps County on the corner of 4th Avenue and West Avenue in downtown Holdrege to apply for an $18,000 operating line of credit against his land to purchase a new valley center pivot irrigation system for the south quarter of his place. He had been a customer of First Citizens for 41 years. He had a modest checking account and a small savings account in the Holdrege branch. He had carried small operating loans in spring of nearly every year of his farming life, paid back in full every November at harvest, never once late. What the new branch manager of First Citizens Bank of Phelps County did not know that Tuesday morning was that Othel Sandborg also held, in a separate account at the First National Bank of Wichita, 320 miles to the south, a savings balance of $2,840,000 accumulated over the previous 8 years from the quarterly royalty checks of 17 oil and gas wells in Stafford County, Kansas, that he had inherited free and clear in the spring of 1971 from his mother's elder brother, a lifelong bachelor wildcatter named Sven Lindgren, who had drilled his first producing well in 1948 on a quarter section of leased ground south of St. John, and had never once told a single member of his family how much money he was actually making. Othel had never spent a dollar of it. He had not bought a new truck. He had not bought a new tractor. He had not built a new house. He had not even told the men he played dominoes with on Saturday mornings at the Atlanta hardware store. He had simply deposited every royalty check in the Wichita savings account and let it sit, the way a careful man lets a fence post set in concrete before he hangs the gate. He thought of it, when he thought of it at all, as Sven's money, not his own. He kept it for the day Inga might get cancer again, in some new and unexpected form, and need a hospital bill paid that he had not anticipated. After Inga died, he kept it for whatever the next thing might be. He had told nobody, not his lawyer in Holdrege, not his accountant, not the men at the co-op, nobody. The new branch manager at First Citizens Bank of Phelps County in April of 1979 was a young man named Dawson Reek. He was 28 years old. He had grown up in Lincoln. He had earned a bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Nebraska in 1973, and a Master of Business Administration from the same institution in 1975. He had spent 4 years working in the main commercial lending department at First Citizens Bank in Lincoln before being promoted in February of 1979 to the position of branch manager at the Holdrege office, which was understood within the bank as a stepping stone position for promising young executives on the corporate track. He had arrived in Holdrege on the 1st of March. He had been on the job exactly 6 weeks on the morning Othel Sandborg walked through his front door. He wore a charcoal gray 3-piece suit. He wore a deep red silk necktie with a small gold pin. He wore polished black wingtip dress shoes. He carried himself as a junior branch manager freshly arrived from Lincoln tends to carry himself, with the easy confidence of a young man who believed he was passing through a small place on his way to a larger one. He had come out of his glass-walled corner office at 10:35 that Tuesday morning to ask the senior teller, a 56-year-old woman named Mason Trotter, who had worked at First Citizens for 29 years, why a man in a dirty coat was standing in the loan officer's queue. Mason Trotter looked up at him and said, in the even, patient voice she used with all of her supervisors, "That is Othel Sandborg, Mr. Reek. He has banked with us for 41 years. He is here to apply for his spring operating loan." Dawson Reek looked across the lobby at the man in the queue. He saw an old fellow in his late 60s, lean and stooped slightly at the shoulders, with thin, straight gray hair carefully combed flat under a worn dark brown felt fedora, a deeply lined face, weathered hands hanging quietly at his sides. The man wore a heavy brown wool double-breasted overcoat that had clearly been worn for 2 decades. The right cuff was frayed. There was dried mud on the boots beneath the hem of the coat. The coat itself was unbuttoned to show a faded blue chambray work shirt, buttoned to the collar, and a pair of dark gray wool dress trousers, slightly rumpled at the knees. The man was not unkempt, exactly, but he looked, to Dawson Reek's freshly minted Lincoln eye, like the kind of marginal small-time operation that Dawson had been told, in his executive training in Lincoln, was the kind of risk a forward-looking branch needed to begin politely declining if the Phelps County office was ever going to grow its book of business with the higher margin commercial accounts the bank now wanted to attract. Dawson Reek did not retreat to his office and ask Mason Trotter to bring him Othel Sandborg's file. He did not look at the 41 years of perfect repayment history. He did not look at the deed records on the 740 acres of paid free wheat and corn ground. He did not look at anything. He walked across the lobby. He stopped in front of Othel in the queue, and in a voice loud enough that the 2 other farmers standing behind Othel could hear every word, he said, "Sir, I am the branch manager. I am sorry, but I am going to have to ask you to step out of the line. We are no longer originating small-ticket agricultural loans of the kind I understand you are here to request. The collateral profile and the operating overhead on this kind of loan no longer fits our portfolio. You will need to try the Federal Land Bank up the street, or perhaps the credit union. I apologize for any inconvenience." The lobby went quiet. Othel Sandborg did not move for a moment. He looked at Dawson Reek. He looked at Mason Trotter behind the teller window, whose face had gone very still. He looked at the 2 other farmers in line behind him, who were staring at the floor. He looked back at Dawson Reek. He was a man who had stood at the line of 1,000 spring fields and 1,000 autumn harvests, and had not flinched at the weather of any of them. And he did not flinch now. He simply looked at Dawson Reek the way a man looks at a frost that has come 3 weeks too early, measuring, accepting, calculating the cost. Then he reached up and tipped the brim of his worn brown felt fedora to the young branch manager, polite as he would have tipped it to a woman in the grocery aisle. And he said in his quiet farmer's voice, "I appreciate your time, sir. Mason, good morning to you." He turned around. He walked back across the lobby. The brass bell over the front door of First Citizens Bank of Phelps County rang behind him as he stepped out onto the sidewalk at 10:39 on the morning of Tuesday, April the 17th, 1979. Mason Trotter watched him go through the glass front window. She did not say anything to Dawson Reek for the rest of the morning. She did not say much for the rest of the week. 29 years she had worked at that bank, and what she had just watched was the worst thing she had ever seen anyone in that lobby due to a customer of the institution. She wrote a brief and careful note in pencil on a telex pad that night at her kitchen table at home. And the next morning she walked the note 3 blocks to the post office and mailed it to the home address of the chairman of the board of First Citizens Bancorp, the Lincoln-based holding company that owned the Phelps County Bank. The chairman, a man named Eldridge Voss, read the note that Friday afternoon in his office in Lincoln. He frowned. He filed it. He made no further reference to it. He had 3 larger problems on his desk that week, and one young man named Dawson Reek seemed to him like a problem he could manage later. Othel Sandborg drove home in his 1968 dark green Ford F-100 pickup along Highway 6 to Atlanta. He pulled into the gravel turnaround beside the farmhouse a little after 11:30. The kitchen was empty. The icebox hummed quietly. Inga's apron still hung on the peg beside the back door, where she had hung it on the last morning of her life. Othel walked into the kitchen. He took off his brown overcoat and laid it over the back of his chair. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the percolator. He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked out the window at the bare cottonwoods along the section line and the spring sky behind them. He drank his coffee slowly. He thought about what had just happened in the bank lobby. He thought about it for 1 full hour. Then he stood up. He walked over to the roll-top desk that had been his father's. He took out a sheet of unlined ivory paper. He wrote a careful letter in his clear schoolteacher's hand to a man named Howard Banson, an oil and gas attorney in Wichita, who had handled Uncle Sven's estate work in 1971 and who had remained on retainer to Othel ever since. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. It asked Howard Banson to drive up to the farm the following Sunday afternoon. It said that Othel had a long, quiet project he wanted to discuss. It said, please bring the corporate stock records on a small Nebraska bank holding company called First Citizens Bancorp, which he believed was publicly traded over the counter on the Lincoln Exchange. It said, please bring a brief on the Nebraska State Banking Commission's procedures for change of control filings. He sealed the letter. He drove it to the post office in Atlanta. He paid for first-class delivery. He drove home. He fixed himself a supper of fried potatoes and a slice of ham and a glass of buttermilk. He sat at the kitchen table and ate his supper, looking out the window at the dusk gathering over the corn ground. He said out loud to the empty chair across from him at the kitchen table, Inga, I think we are about to buy a bank. Howard Banson drove up from Wichita on Sunday the 22nd of April. He was a tall, sandy-haired man of 59 years, lean and quick-eyed, with a Phi Beta Kappa key from the University of Kansas hanging on his watch chain, and a reputation in 3 states for being the patient kind of oil and gas lawyer who took 20 years to win the cases he wanted to win. He brought a thin leather briefcase and the requested stock records, and a calm understanding that Othel Sandborg did not ask for anything he did not intend to follow through on. They sat at the kitchen table. Howard read the stock records aloud. First Citizens Bancorp was a small, publicly traded, Lincoln-based bank holding company. It owned 6 small-town Nebraska bank branches, including the Phelps County branch. Its total outstanding stock was 1,160,000 shares, trading thinly on the over-the-counter market at about $13.20 a share, for a total market capitalization of roughly $15 million. Its largest individual shareholder, Eldridge Voss, held about 9%. The remaining stock was held by approximately 40 Nebraska families and a handful of institutional accounts. Othel listened to all of this in his usual quiet way. Then he asked one question. "Howard, if we wanted to acquire 51% of that stock, slowly, without alerting the chairman or driving the price up, how would we go about it?" Howard Banson looked at his client across the kitchen table. He had been Othel's lawyer for 8 years. He had been waiting, in the back of his mind, for the day Othel would finally ask a question of this kind. He had not expected the question to be about a small Nebraska bank. "It would take some time," he said carefully. 2 to 3 years, depending on the market. We would set up a Kansas corporate nominee, register it with the Nebraska State Banking Commission as a passive shareholder. We would acquire stock in small blocks of 500 to 2,000 shares from individual families at modest premiums to market, paid in cash. We would avoid the institutional accounts who would talk. We would file with the Banking Commission only when we crossed 25%, and then again at the formal change of control threshold. Othel nodded slowly. He looked out the window at the cottonwoods along the section line. "How much money would it take?" Howard Banson looked down at his stock records. He did some arithmetic. He looked up. "Roughly $9 to $11 million, if we are patient and if the market does not move on us." Othel did not say anything for a long moment. Then he stood up. He walked to the icebox. He took down a small wooden cigar box from on top of the icebox, where Inga had always kept her recipe cards and the small things she did not want lost. He opened the cigar box. He took out a single thin yellowed paper. He laid it on the kitchen table in front of Howard Banson. It was the most recent quarterly royalty statement from the First National Bank of Wichita, dated March 31st, 1979. The savings account balance was $2,840,000 and change. The royalty deposits for the quarter alone had been $138,000. Howard Banson read the statement carefully. He looked up at Othel. He did not say anything. He had known about Uncle Sven's royalty trust since 1971. He had not realized Othel had been simply letting it sit in a savings account for 8 years. "Howard, I have not touched a dollar of this since the day my Uncle Sven's executor signed it over to me. I have not even drawn on the interest. I would like, beginning this month, to begin moving it into whatever vehicle you think best suited for the slow purchase of First Citizens Bancorp common stock. I do not want to be a bank president. I do not want to give speeches at Chamber of Commerce dinners. I want to own that bank in Holdrege quietly, by the spring of 1982 at the latest, and I want to walk in the front door on a morning of my own choosing, and I want to fire the young man who turned me out of the lobby last Tuesday morning. And I want to tell the men in line behind him, the next time it is them standing where I stood, that the bank they are standing in will not refuse them because of the coat they are wearing. That is all I want." He paused. He looked at Howard Banson. "Will you help me do that?" Howard Banson, who had been a lawyer for 33 years and who had advised some of the most calculating men in 3 states, did something then that he had not done in a courtroom or a boardroom since 1962. He took off his reading glasses. He set them on the kitchen table. He nodded once. He said, "Yes, I will help you do that, Othel." They shook hands across the kitchen table. Howard Banson drove home to Wichita that evening. By the following Friday, Howard had registered a Kansas-domiciled passive investment nominee called Stafford County Holdings Limited with the Nebraska State Banking Commission. By the end of May, Stafford County Holdings had purchased 46,000 shares of First Citizens Bancorp common stock from 3 small Phelps County families in private transactions at $13.40 a share, paid in cashier's check. Othel had transferred $616,000 from Wichita into the Stafford County Holdings operating account. By the end of December 1979, Stafford County Holdings owned just under 8% of First Citizens Bancorp common stock, and Othel had transferred a total of $1,240,000 from Wichita. Then the world began to turn in his favor. In October of 1979, the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker raised the federal funds rate to 13 3/8% and signaled it would do so again. By the spring of 1980, agricultural land values across the Great Plains began to slide. By the summer of 1981, the prime rate at the largest commercial banks in the country hit 20.5%. Farm operating loans across Nebraska and Iowa and Kansas began to default in volumes that had not been seen since the 1930s. Small Nebraska banks holding too many of those loans began to wobble. The trading price of First Citizens Bancorp common stock, which had stood at $13.20 in April of 1979, fell to $9 in October of 1980, fell again to $6.40 in March of 1981, and reached its bottom at $4.90 in the second week of December 1981. By that point, Stafford County Holdings had quietly accumulated 38% of the outstanding common stock at an average cost of $7.12 a share, and had transferred a total of $3,140,000 from Othel Sandborg's Wichita savings account. Eldridge Voss, the chairman of the holding company, had no idea where the buying was coming from. In January of 1982, the Nebraska State Banking Commission ordered First Citizens Bancorp to recapitalize. The bank had taken too many losses on the farm loan portfolios in 3 of its branches. It needed a fresh $14 million of equity by April, or it would be placed in receivership and sold to the highest bidder. Eldridge Voss tried to raise the money from his Lincoln Insurance Company connections and could not. By the second week of March 1982, the holding company stock had fallen to $3.80, and Stafford County Holdings was buying every share that came onto the over-the-counter market. On the morning of Monday, March 22, 1982, Stafford County Holdings filed a formal change of control notice with the Nebraska State Banking Commission. The filing disclosed that the entity was the holder of 51.3% of the common stock of First Citizens Bancorp. The filing further disclosed that the ultimate beneficial owner of Stafford County Holdings was a single Nebraska resident, an individual named Othel Sandborg of Atlanta, Phelps County, Nebraska. Eldridge Voss read the filing in his office in Lincoln on a Tuesday afternoon and put his head in his hands and laughed for about a minute. And then he wiped his eyes and walked down the hall to inform the board that he was tendering his resignation effective at the close of the next regular board meeting. Howard Bonson and Othel Sandborg met with the Nebraska State Banking Commission in Lincoln on Wednesday, April the 21st. The commission approved the change of control on a single condition, that Othel commit in writing to a $14 million capital infusion into the holding company by the end of April. Othel signed the commitment in pen across the kitchen table of a Lincoln coffee shop with Howard sitting beside him. The capital infusion cleared on April the 29th, on the morning of Friday, May the 7th, 1982, almost exactly 3 years after he had walked out of First Citizens Bank of Phelps County in his worn brown overcoat, with his hat tipped politely to the senior teller. Othel Sandborg drove his 1968 dark green Ford F-100 into Holdrege and parked in front of the same bank building on the corner of 4th Avenue and West Avenue. He sat for a moment in the cab of the truck, and he looked at the gold lettering on the front window. He pulled on the same brown wool double-breasted overcoat with the patched lining and the frayed right cuff. He set the same brown felt fedora on his head. He stepped out of the truck. He walked across the sidewalk and pushed open the front door of First Citizens Bank of Phelps County. The brass bell rang above the door. It was 9:45 in the morning. Mason Trotter was at the teller window. She looked up when the bell rang. She saw who had come in. Her eyes filled, very quietly, and she folded her hands together on the counter to steady herself. And she did not say a word, because she had been waiting 3 years for this moment, without quite knowing she had been waiting. Dawson Reek was in his glass-walled corner office. He was on the telephone, leaning back in his swivel chair, his polished black wingtip dress shoes propped on the corner of his oak desk. He glanced up through the glass wall and saw the old man in the brown coat walking across the lobby toward his office, and for half a second he did not recognize him. And then he did, and he set the telephone receiver down slowly into its cradle, and he sat up in his chair, and he watched Othel Sandborg walk across the lobby with the steady, patient stride of a man who had walked across his own corn ground for 50 winters in a row. Othel knocked once on the glass door of Dawson Reek's corner office. Dawson stood up. He opened the door. He did not say anything. Othel walked in. He did not take off his coat. He set his felt fedora on the corner of Dawson's desk. He reached into the inside pocket of the brown overcoat. He took out a single folded letter on First Citizens Bancorp corporate letterhead, signed by the new chairman of the board, Othel L. Sandborg of Atlanta, Nebraska, in his clear schoolteacher's hand. He laid the letter flat on Dawson Reek's desk and smoothed it once with the back of his weathered hand. "Mr. Reek, my name is Othel Sandborg. I do not believe we have been properly introduced. I was in this lobby on the morning of Tuesday, April the 17th, 1979, applying for an $18,000 operating line of credit against my land, which is paid free and clear, and which my great-grandfather filed on in 1879. You turned me away in the queue, in front of 2 other farmers and the senior teller. You did not look at my file. You did not look at my deed records. You did not look at my 41 years of perfect repayment history with this institution. You looked at my coat. As of 9:43 this morning, I am the controlling shareholder of First Citizens Bancorp and the chairman of its board of directors. This letter is a notice from the board to you, terminating your employment with this institution effective at the close of business this afternoon, with severance of 6 months' salary and continuation of health insurance through the end of the calendar year. Mason Trotter at the teller window has your final paycheck and your severance documents. I would ask you to clear your office by 5 o'clock this afternoon. I would also like you, before you go, to write a brief letter of apology to the 2 other farmers you embarrassed in this lobby 3 years ago, whose names Mason Trotter will provide. I will personally see that the letters are delivered. Good morning, Mr. Reek. Dawson Reek did not speak for a long moment. He looked at the letter on the desk. He looked at the old man in the worn brown coat standing across the desk from him. He looked at his own polished wingtip shoes and the deep red silk necktie and the small gold pin. He understood, in that moment, the way a man in his position can be made to understand a thing all at once. Exactly what had just been done to him and exactly why. He swallowed once. He sat down in his swivel chair. He picked up the letter. He read it slowly. Mr. Sandborg, I do not know what to say. You do not need to say anything to me, Mr. Reek. You need to write what I asked you to write. I will see myself out. Othel Sandborg picked up his brown felt fedora. He put it back on his head. He turned around. He walked out of the glass-walled corner office. He crossed the lobby. There were 2 farmers at that moment standing in the loan officer's queue, the same queue where Othel had stood 3 years earlier. One was a man Othel recognized, a fellow named Edward Skoog from a section south of Bertrand, who had stood behind him in the same queue on the morning of April 17th and had heard every word Dawson Reek had said. The other was a younger man, a tenant farmer from west of Funk, in a denim work jacket and a feed store cap, who Othel did not know. Othel walked up to the 2 of them. He took off his felt fedora and held it against his chest. He looked at both of them. Gentlemen, my name is Othel Sandborg. As of this morning, I am the controlling shareholder of this bank. Edward, I owe you an apology for what you saw in this lobby 3 years ago. You should not have had to watch that. It will not happen again under my ownership. Young fellow, I do not know your name, but I know what kind of jacket you are wearing, and I know what kind of look the young man in the corner office gave it when you walked in this morning. I would like you both to know one thing. From this day forward, this bank will not refuse a man because of the coat he is wearing, or the dirt on his boots, or the truck he drives, or the size of the loan he is here to ask for. From this day forward, in this bank, a man's name and his word and his land are enough. They are sufficient. They are all we require. That has always been the right way to run a small-town bank in Phelps County, Nebraska. And from this day forward, it is the way this bank will be run. Good morning to you both. He put his felt fedora back on his head. He tipped it once, politely, to Mason Trotter at the teller window. Mason Trotter, who was weeping openly now into a folded handkerchief, lifted her hand in return. Othel walked out of the front door of First Citizens Bank of Phelps County. The brass bell rang above the door. He drove 4 blocks east on West Avenue. He turned south on Burlington Street. He drove 3 more blocks. He pulled into the gravel turnaround at the side gate of the Holdrege Municipal Cemetery. He parked under a cottonwood. He stepped out of the truck. He walked across the close-clipped spring grass to the eastern row of headstones near the wrought iron fence. He stopped at a small, modest stone of polished gray Vermont granite, the lettering still clean and sharp. Inja Holmgren Sandborg, 1913 to 1974, beloved wife. He knelt slowly on the grass beside the stone. He took off his felt fedora and laid it on the grass beside his knee. He set his right hand flat on the cool granite of the headstone. He did not say anything for a long minute. The spring wind moved through the cottonwoods overhead. A meadowlark called from somewhere out across the section road. Then he said very quietly, to the headstone and to the grass and to the spring sky, "I bought the bank, Inga. I bought it. Not for me. For the next man in a worn coat who walks through that front door. I think you would have understood. I think you would have stitched the coat one more time and told me to go ahead." He paused. "I miss you every morning. I will miss you every morning for the rest of whatever time I have. I will see you again when it is time. Until then, I'm going to keep the place running. I'm going to keep the bank running the way Daddy would have wanted it run. And I'm going to keep the coat going for as long as the cloth holds." He kept his hand on the headstone for another long minute. Then he picked up his fedora. He stood slowly to his feet. He set the fedora back on his head. He walked back to the 1968 dark green Ford F-100. He climbed into the cab. He started the engine. He drove home to the farm in Atlanta. The kitchen was empty. The icebox hummed quietly. Inga's apron still hung on the peg beside the back door. He took off his brown overcoat. He laid it carefully over the back of his kitchen chair. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the percolator. He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at the empty chair across from him. He raised his coffee cup slightly toward the empty chair. "To you, Inga, to Daddy, to Uncle Sven, to Mason Trotter, to the next man in a worn coat, to all of us." He drank his coffee. And that, friends, that is the story. That is the story of an old Nebraska farmer who walked into a bank in his worn brown wool overcoat on a spring morning in 1979 and was turned away in the lobby by a young man who did not know what he was looking at, and who walked back into the same bank 3 years later in the same worn coat, and who fired the young man before lunch, and who told the two farmers standing in the queue behind him that from that morning forward, in that bank, a man's name and his word and his land were enough. That was the story Mason Trotter told her grandchildren for the next 31 years. That was the story old Edward Skoog told the young tenant farmer from west of Funk over coffee at the Atlanta hardware store the following Saturday morning, who told it to his cousin, who told it to a writer from the Holdrege Citizen, who wrote it up in the back page of the paper the next spring under the headline, "Old Phelps County Man Quietly Buys Local Bank, Promises Open Door." That was the only headline Othel Sandborg ever appeared in for the rest of his life. He went home, friends. He kept the coat going for another 4 winters. He sat at the kitchen table every evening, and he raised his coffee cup to the empty chair across from him. He ran the bank through Mason Trotter as his branch manager from May of 1982 forward, with the steady, patient hand of a man who had finished what his daddy had started and what his wife had asked him to finish, until he was finally laid down beside Inga in the cemetery off Burlington Street in the spring of 1991, in the same brown wool overcoat his daddy had bought him in Lincoln in 1958, with the patched lining Inga had stitched in 1973, because that was the coat he had worn through all the days of his life that had mattered most, and he was not going to be put away in any other. You cannot tell, friends. You cannot ever tell. From the cut of a man's coat, from the frayed cuff, from the dirt on his boots, from the quiet way he tips his fedora to a teller who has worked for him for 41 years, you cannot tell what that man has inherited. You cannot tell what he has loved. You cannot tell what he has lost. You cannot tell 3 years from any given morning of your life what that quiet old fellow in the line behind you is preparing to do, or how long he has been preparing to do it. So when an old farmer in a worn coat walks into your bank or your store or your office or your church or your life, you do not refuse him, friends. You do not turn him out of the queue. You look at his file, you look at his land, you look at his name and his word, and you let him stand where he has earned the right to stand. Because that is the only way you will ever learn what kind of man he really is.